So I'm going to talk about something relatively easy and relatively unlike the last two talks that talked about things that were really hard to think about. Hopefully this is going to be relatively easy to think about. Keep in mind that these are all ideas that are very much in flux, as you'll see, and I'm very open and interested in your feedback. And these are, I think, ideas that ought to be circulating with other ideas that address the same body of problems. But it isn't much past that point. I mean, there is a demonstration and a proof of concept, but much of what I'm talking about remains to be tested. The backstory is that I was asked back in December to help with a customer in Germany who was looking at the problem of round-tripping JATS into an HTML-based CMS, and they were looking at doing this because they wanted to use an HTML-based editing platform to do edits in their content and then feed it back into the JATS. And of course, my first question was, well, why do you have to do that? Can't you have a front end to edit the XML? And they said, we asked, and we kind of can't. And that was kind of it for me. It was sort of like, am I interested in helping or not? So I had a few more questions about, what the parameters of the project were, because of course my answer to that was, well, this is a hard problem. And they said, yeah, we know, but as we communicated about it, it became clear to me that although it was still a hard problem, it wasn't necessarily a completely intractable problem. And so what you see here is the beginnings of an architecture or an approach that may deal with the problem, at least for this particular operation. And then, of course, we'll get to see what the boundaries of the solution are so that you can see where it won't apply. Let's talk first about what the problem is. Of course, the problem is the classic problem of downstream versus upstream conversions. These are terms of art. Everybody in this room probably knows these terms, but just to remind us, what we're talking about is a difference between a transformation where you are simply translating the language into another representation of the same information, maybe even removing and simplifying it because there's information in the source that you don't need in the result of your transformation. That would be down, versus up when you're actually trying to make inferences about information or add information that isn't already explicitly given in the markup, right? Now, it can be given in a number of different ways. It can be hidden in various ways. It can sort of be deployed in attribute values. It can be actually in the content. The content may be structured in some way. Then you can make inferences. There may be flat structures which you need to be nested structures, and you can perhaps make inferences about the nesting based on the arrangement of the stuff in the flat, and so forth and so on. So, there are a number of different ways in which we sort of deal with this up conversion problem. But fundamentally, it's a hard problem, and that's because adding information is going to be, problematic. In that context, I want to stress that when we talk about up conversion here, we're not talking about simply dumping a bunch of HTML data into JATS, right? I mean, just a straight long list of paragraphs or something like that. No, we mean actual, real, strong JATS. JATS that has the structure, JATS where the elements are marked up correctly, and so forth and so on. That's typically very difficult to do. Why is this? Well, basically the reason is because the JATS environment that we like to live in, we like to live in it because it's a well-controlled environment. It's something that has edges around it. We know what's in it and what's outside of it, and we have tools that help us to distinguish between things that are conformant with JATS in general, or maybe conformant with our own in-house profile of JATS. And then tell us that, no, these things are out of bounds. That's not valid. That's not correct. There are problems here. Send it back or fix it, right? Whereas the HTML environment is relatively unconstrained compared to that. It has a lot of room in it for individuality or creativity, and there are relatively less controls. It's not that you can't validate HTML. You can validate it, but often the information that you get back, this is valid or not valid, isn't actually very helpful. because it can be valid without being actually very useful to you. Now, of course, we do perform up conversions, and we perform up conversions in a number of different technologies. Historically, we use Perl. I'm an XSLT guy. I use XSLT to do up conversions. But the problem is that it's a development that doesn't scale very well because of the limits around the problem, right? Every transformation covers a defined set of inputs, and then the minute the inputs don't fit that definition, we have issues. And as a consequence, what we have is this loop that we get involved in where we transform, then we discover that our stuff isn't valid. In the diamonds here in my diagrams, valid here is kind of a code, if you like, for a whole set of things that includes formal validity against a schema, but also other constraints that we may be checking. And we discover that it doesn't follow our rules, and we have to go back and we have to tweak our transformation in order to handle the input and give us output that we want. And of course, the range of inputs is such that we spend our entire life circulating inside of this loop, and not a whole lot gets back up into the JATS. Right? So that is, in a sense, the essence of the problem. Now, once you've identified it like that, of course, if you can actually understand your problem, you can begin to understand the solution. The solution that I offered my customer here, which really told me that this project was actually feasible, was that in fact we're in a position where we can define and specify for the HTML side of our exchange, for our HTML partners, we could define and describe an HTML profile that we would accept. And this is a really, really critical aspect of our architecture because, in effect, what we're saying is we're not going to accept just any HTML. We're actually going to define a subset of HTML, which we're going to then promise to accept. And the essence of this is in defining a mapping, a clean mapping between the JATS profile that we have, and in this case, we went so far as to say we're even going to limit it to the data set that we have currently, and we're going to, because that gives us a good place to start, right? And then we can expand as the data set expands, but we're not even going to warrant that we handle all JATS, right? We're simply going to look at the data we have, we're going to define a clean mapping into HTML, we're going to define that mapping sufficiently rigorously so that it contains the information that we need, so that when we dump HTML, dump our JATS into HTML, it lives in that HTML environment, it can be manipulated, it can be edited, as long as the rules are followed of our JATS flavored HTML, if you like, then we can read it back again. And the important thing is that this changes the looping, right? The loop is that we're going to, when it's not valid, we're going to toss it back to the HTML people and say, please fix this, right? And that means that this transformation suddenly doesn't have to be an open-ended set of proposition that handles everything. Instead, we can manage the development of this up conversion transformation the same as we manage the development of downstream. And both of these can be tied very, very closely to the mapping, right? So the mapping gives us a place to start. This solves a number of different problems for us. For one thing, we don't need to warrant that we're going to collect everything. We're going to do what I call sniffing JATS. We're going to look for JATS, and we're going to convert the JATS that we see. If we see something that's not JATS, then that's going to warrant us to pass it back. So our rule is going to be, if it's not something that we can recognize, we're actually going to allow it through to be invalid. This means that the problem, as I just described, turns into a problem of defining the mapping. The key here is that we're going to make our mapping so simple and so dead obvious that you can, when you encounter a problem, you can determine quite readily where the failure is, right? Because we need this feedback to be actionable. right? We need something to come back to say, not just this is not valid, but this is not valid because X, and we need this to be intelligible so that on the HTML side they can lock down their editing environment or do whatever they need to do to prevent this from happening and make sure it happens correctly. So the reason there's no pressure on us is because, of course, there's a great deal of pressure on our HTML friends. They say this is okay because they are going to control their environment the way we control ours. Let's define the mapping. And the goal here is the mapping is going to be as dead simple as we can possibly make it. Now, of course, the idea of hiding your semantics into your HTML in the form of class attributes is not a new idea. In fact, people were doing that already 15 years ago. Basically, the day the class attribute was introduced and CSS hit the markets, people have been doing this. And it's one reason why web developers consider themselves to be knowledge engineers, is because they have this capability. So basically, as you can see here, we've simply just dropped these labels in. And that's our simple rule. Simply express the JATS semantics on the way down in class attributes. And then we have to define what we mean by that. So we're going to go back to our data set and say JATS means what we have that we call JATS. We can go to a schema if we want to do that, or we can go to the data set. But in any case, we've got a list of values that we're going to recognize as JATS values. Now, one of the keys here that I should, many of you are thinking, and the rest of you need to keep in mind that hasn't struck you yet, that in HTML, it's perfectly legal to have more than one value on class. Right? So we have to deal with the contingency that the class is not going to be a single unitary value. It may not always be there, or it may even be ambiguous. It may not have a value we recognize, or it may have more than one. So our rule here is going to be that, well, it needs to be not only something we recognize as JATS, but it needs to be unambiguous in the sense that we don't have two reserved terms, JATS labels floating around. If that happens, we're going to pretend that we didn't see any. So you keep the rules very, very clear and simple. They're a little strict, but they're easy to understand and follow. Now, of course, the real fun starts, because then, of course, you need to map the tags themselves, right? I mean, in the case of this example, what is it that says we have divs here, and what is it that says we have Piez here? Now, interestingly, if we take the approach of mapping our JATS into HTML classes, much of the pressure of this mapping is relieved, because in a sense, when we go downhill, we don't really care. We can map everything into divs and spans, but we don't necessarily want to do that, partly because we want to at least let the HTML have some integrity as HTML, so we're going to go a little bit further. Now in this project, we were able to drive the mapping based on a survey of the data set, and the data set that we were starting with wasn't really terribly huge, so this was really not difficult to do. Basically what that amounted to was that there were a couple of special purpose elements with special purpose semantics that we didn't want to handle just in CSS. Lists were a big, probably the best example of that. And so we were going to map them specifically. And of course, JATS has attributes in it that help us with this. We can target different HTML lists. Similarly, when we have inline stuff, we can do a better semantic mapping than simply dumping everything in spans. These are not necessarily things that are critical, but they're easy things for us to do. As long as our scope is well managed, it's not really that, it doesn't have real great implications, because the list is not large, things are not very complex. So we still have a very simple mapping even with these. One of the interesting things about this is that, of course, there are edges that you have to worry about. There are your links and your special purpose, semantics on images and so forth and so on. We will, address those based on what we find in the data and what we need to handle. But probably about 97% of the tagging that goes through is simply pass through according to this list, this set of principles. And notice that we're actually going to accept a certain amount of redundancy here, right? That we're going to say P classical P. And we'll get to why that is a little bit more in a second. Now, the other thing to point out about this is that since we've basically already said, well, we've got a very simple set of rules for mapping, and then we have a bunch of sort of exceptions, you know, those links or, you know, special purpose lists or so forth and so on, we can layer our solution in the form of a generic solution, an XSLT that performs a generic transformation, and then have another XSLT that provides for all the special purpose, customized, application-specific mappings that can call on the generic set of mappings for most of the work and then just intervene when it needs to do something specific. So we have an architecture that supports development that way. Of course, one thing everybody's asking is, what about the attributes that's going to be such a headache? And yes, it is such a headache. This is our first idea. This is perhaps not something that you want to recommend to your kids, that you in effect invent a notation. And I invented a little double dot notation that was actually in testing robust enough to carry these values through. But that was going to be a problem for a number of reasons. Fortunately, in HTML5, we have a new set of a sort of interesting, very un-XML-ish kind of rule that HTML5 supports arbitrary attributes on elements that prefixed with the data hyphen string. So HTML5 documents can be valid with any of these guys. And so we're just going to hop on that. We're just going to ride right on top of that and say, just map the JATS straight in, put a prefix onto the attribute so it lives in the HTML environment, let the value be the value, and then coming back, we can read it, right? So things are beginning to come together. You can begin to see the, you know, the shape and the outline of this approach. Then when we come back, we're going to look for all this information, and then when we see it, we're going to pull it back into JATS. So the rules are pretty simple, and we've already touched on most of them. We simply look for the class attribute. If the class attribute includes a value that we recognize as JATS 1 and 1 only value, then we're going to turn our element name, whatever it is, into that value, right? So something that's marked as class equal disp quote becomes a display quote, disp quote. Now, if you have two JATS values, as I said a minute ago, that's not going to change. That's going to come through as an HTML div into our output. That, of course, means that the output can be invalid. This is because we're going to say, oh, you didn't really follow the rules here. We don't really know what this is. Can you fix this for us, right? So you know, our approach is that that failure or validation is not telling us that we have failed in our transformation. It's telling us that the data needs a little bit of work before we can actually deal with it. And then when we do this, we are also going to propagate these attributes. Pull them back up by simply grabbing that attribute and removing the data hyphen substring from that name and popping it on there. We could do this in a little smarter way if we wanted to. We could say, oh, this is a disp quote. We actually know what sorts of values, attributes and values are allowed in JATS on that. But for now, we're just pulling them all and then allowing things again to be invalid if invalid attributes come through. And then everything that doesn't follow these rules copies through in place. And that's because we want to see it. We want to see where things fail. So this imperfection, this notion that we're going to do certain things that follow certain simple rules and not try to do anything else is really the key here. Because we expect many of our outputs to not be valid. And the reason for that is that we don't want to introduce the complications of making inferences that work some of the time and then maybe don't work other of the time, and then when they don't work you have to figure out why they worked over there but not over here, or you know, all of the sort of questions that come about when your XSLT or your upconversion process does a lot of smart inferencing, right? We wanted the transformation itself to be as simple as possible so that it would be transparent. Also notice that while we can recapture JATS information coming back, what that means is that when you add semantic information in the HTML, unless that's expressed in the form that we recognize, that kind of JATS flavored XML, that's not going to come back. Right? The question, is that a feature or is that a bug, is a question that we'll take up with our HTML developers. It may well be that we can actually learn to accommodate some kinds of semantic expression in the HTML and translate them into JATS forms, but we'd like to see what we have first before we make the commitment to do that, because we're not working in an open-ended environment. Along the way, of course, in the real world, things are actually more complicated. There's metadata to worry about. The metadata may be expressed differently in the two systems. There may be a mapping there that is more particular than a simple straight sort of dump into class attributes that we just saw. What I've seen so far is that this is actually not really very difficult. Metadata, it turns out not to be that much of a headache. And similarly, links and linking logic, you might think that would be a real headache. And that turned out to be much less of a problem than I thought it might be. And I think a lot of that is due to the particular CMS environment that we were working with. And the approach the HTML developers were taking, because that was very compatible with our approach here. We didn't have any tables, we didn't have any out-of-line embedded formats, so that solved that problem for us. One might well anticipate that they would present problems when you have them, but as you know, one of the table models in JATS is an HTML table model, and so we already have a lot of compatibility there. This particular customer doesn't have any Oasis CALS tables in sight. That's a particular area, but these days conversions back and forth between HTML and CALS are even doable. So even that is not really going to be completely intractable. So those are all things that one might expect to spend more time with. Even without a lot of that kind of support and just the sort of raw, bare bones pilot version of this project, things work surprisingly well. We are able successfully to round trip this stuff. The reason for that is that the problems really are quite easy to diagnose. If you get stuff back and you validate it to JATS and then you see HTML popping up, you can see what that is. You can locate it easily in the source, and you can establish what a remedy would be. So the transparency or the intelligibility of the whole mapping is critical. The other thing is, of course, that we have an interesting question about how much extra work do we want to go to accommodate the foibles on the HTML side. And the answer to that is, well, as much as we feel we can do, right? We can actually do quite a bit more. For example, one of the things that you might have wondered about as we scooted by this is the thing about paragraphs, right? We say that if a paragraph isn't marked as class equal P, we're not going to see it as a paragraph. Well, isn't that awfully rigid? Why? I mean, what's so controversial about a P in HTML? Why shouldn't a paragraph in HTML just become a paragraph in JATS? Right? Well, our approach to that is, well, we know that an HTML paragraph is more or less semantically, there are little interesting differences between the way they model things. For example, in HTML, paragraphs cannot have lists in them, which is very interesting. In JATS, lists can turn up in the middle of paragraphs. But by and large, a P is a P is a P, right? So what's the big deal? Well, of course, a P is a P is a P, but where a paragraph is allowed is not completely open-ended in JATS. And we do have concern with the implicit logic inside the HTML, where all the JATS is sort of layered there in classes, but none of the actual checking or, there is no DTD, there is no schema to give us any sort of backbone to know that here's a place where we're allowed to have a paragraph, and here's a place where we are not allowed to have a paragraph, right? We depend entirely on the fact that we're going to just transform stuff, and then we're going to rely on validation in the JATS side in order to solve that problem. Now, this has actually worked pretty well for us. But I can readily imagine a situation in which you might say, well, okay, we'll relax the rule, and if, unless we disqualify a P for some other reason, we're going to accept paragraphs in general. We're not going to drop them. And we might see a significant reduction in the number of validation errors that we got after the transformation if we do that. That depends entirely on the HTML side and how that's being controlled. So it's not something we want to do without working with the actual situation in the actual system. So, of course, the big question that comes up is, well, that's a nice trick, is to not worry about the format of the HTML until post-transformation, but can't we do better than that, right? I mean, in a sense, what we're doing here is validation in the application, right? It's the application itself that's telling us, is the HTML good stuff or not, right? And it turns out that this is actually okay to our HTML team because that's pretty much what they're used to. Right? They don't regard formal validation against a schema as being a really big deal in their world because their major concern is how well does it work in the systems that we have. So we're sort of taking advantage of that, and yet we also know that validation before or external to an application is actually a tremendously valuable asset, especially when you're producing content or editing it. The next question that comes up is, can't we do a better job than simply validate it post-transformation? And that leads into a very, very interesting set of problems because, of course, then we begin to have to actually inspect those class attributes and discover what their relations are. And as you know, that involves quite a number of different kinds of things that are all going to translate interestingly into what we call co-occurrence constraints in the HTML. And of course, what we mean by that is when we have X, then we expect Y, and X may be over here in the data, and Y may be over here in the data. So a classic case would be the paragraph appearing before a head in a section. Right? It's not illegal because it's a paragraph. It's illegal because it happened before the head, and the head has to be the first element. And in JATS, we have content models to tell us this. If that information is layered in our HTML and we have a P for the paragraph and maybe a div or an H1 for the head, it's all valid HTML. There's no problem on the HTML side. We have to detect that those class attributes are actually out of order. And similarly, we have co-occurrence constraints for our usage of attributes and so forth and so on. Now, as it happens, even these are, although it's complex, are not completely intractable, right? So, for example, here's a little bit of schematron. I had to throw some gnarly code in there for, I know some of you would like that. And this schematron basically says, when we have an element in the HTML that is marked as being a disp quote by our JATS rules, then we're going to test its attributes. And the way we do that is we're going to say, we're going to declare a couple of strings here as being legitimate JATS attributes that we can accept. And then we're going to see if we have any things that don't follow those rules, right? So a lot of logic is going to be buried into these little functions that are here, which are going to perform tasks for us that we are going to be doing over and over again, right? In this case, classes presumably is going to return us all of the class values, and in this case we can say if any of these is equal to disp quote, then we've got a match. And similarly on testing the data attributes, we have a function that's basically going to return all the data attributes and then look at their names, and if the names of the things coming back from this function, if we have any that are not among our JATS attributes, then we've got things marked as wrong or known to be wrong, right? And then we simply assert that we don't have any things known to be wrong. If we do have things known to be wrong, and our schematron announces that, oh, you're not allowed to do this, and it's even able to write out what all the attributes are, right? So you can run this on the HTML, and the schematron is able to detect that you've got an element in your HTML that's designated to be a JATS disp quote that has attributes on it that are similarly marked as JATS by virtue of being data attributes, except they're not because they're not valid against the schema, right? The key thing here is to know that all of this logic is completely generic and it can be used for any element in JATS. The only differences are going to be here, right? Every JATS element is going to have its own permissible attributes, and here what those attributes are. So that suggests that this code is, although complicated, also boilerplate, right? And we ought to be able to write this. We ought to be able to generate it from a schema, for example. So that gives us hope in the idea that we would actually begin to constrain the HTML itself, even before running it through the transformation. Down here is, in the footnote, is the English translation of what this rule tests. If you have a disk quote, then your only attributes are content type or specific use, and others accounted for otherwise, because there may be others that you don't actually decide to represent using the data convention. ID and XML lang would be good examples of attributes that are allowed on disk quote, which you may have another mapping for. And your function library is going to know that, right? So when your function library returns the data attributes, it knows to ignore ID, right? And not look at ID and not name check ID. So this kind of leads more generally to a set of principles that my mental name for this is aesthetic HTML, because I'm sort of enamored of the idea that if I follow rules, my life is going to be simplified, right? I was just reading that the president no longer wears any suits except gray and blue because he doesn't want to decide what to wear in the morning. And he lets other people decide what he's going to have for lunch because he's already deciding too many things. Take a page from that book, define the rules clearly. You're going to externalize the requirements for the HTML systems, right? Those requirements may not take the form of a formal schema, although we will get there, but they are going to take the form of a simple set of rules and documentation for those rules so that everybody can know what those are, right? And then to support those rules, you're going to have tools that translate back and forth. This, of course, is not an approach that, if you happen to be one of those sort of, quiet TEI people that sometimes comes to these conferences, you can do this in TEI too. I know you're out there. Part of this is, coming out of the XML world, I can state pretty confidently from my experience that, you don't get output without messing with your markup, right? And in many ways, I think that even, in fact, the discussion we were just having a few minutes ago about Word and why Word, right? I mean, the reason Word serves authors' needs, according to Jeff, is because authors' needs are to provide their editor with a Word document. As long as that's the case, you're in a sense hiding the problem, right? Because you're always going to have to be getting into the markup in order to create strong output. And we can, yes, in fact, automate a tremendous amount of that. And it's really cool already to see in the morning of day one how much progress we're making on that front, because both of the papers that we saw earlier are addressing the improvement in dealing with badly managed information. But by no means are we going to get it to a world where messing with a markup is something you never ever have to do, right? I mean, that's going to happen only in little islands of content people where they don't even their tools are so well refined and so highly developed for their particular use case that they don't even have to think about what happens under the covers. I think it's going to be quite a while before the rest of us get there. And of course, with that, another way of putting this lesson is that oftentimes you adopt a new platform or a standard, and you think that, well, that's going to solve our problems, and actually it's not solving any problems at all. What it's doing is giving you a place to start when you solve your problems, right? It means that you're not actually trying to deal with undefined problems. You have now begun to actually get a handle on those problems by providing definitions. And if this is true in the XML world, I expect it's going to be true in the HTML world as well. That's a world which is much more dynamic and under a considerable number of stresses that don't really necessarily apply in our world. Different different. I mean, it's not like we don't have the stresses, but you know, they face a different set of stresses. And interestingly enough, I'm kind of coming at this with the idea that, in fact, our perspective on this can actually really, really help the HTML world, because we live in a world where we know that following rules saves us trouble. You know, rules are not necessarily an unjust imposition. And in fact, when you take this approach, you begin to be a little bit more permissive and tolerant of the variety of different approaches out there, because tooling these days is getting so good that we can be very neutral to the forms that the inputs take. And as long as we have tools that can render them into computationally tractable data models that we know how to work with, and in the case of XML XSLT, that tends to be a tree-shaped data model, right? As long as we can get into that, we can then move forward on that basis. And so that means that, yes, in fact, you know, we can support a markdown-based approach or whatever you might have, as long as we can get structured data out of it. So what it really comes back down to is the idea of exerting control over the HTML, whether that information in the HTML be implicit or between the lines. We're still going to say that it matters, and we're still going to try to control it. And then the trade-off that we're going to offer is that in return for that control, we get functionality, right? We get the ability to actually do things. So the architecture of the system we're eventually going to is actually kind of interesting, because ideally we would have a schema that we could apply before transformation that would then give us the feedback that we needed in order to fix the HTML going in. And then the final validation would hopefully be completely pro forma, right? I mean, if this validation passed, then and transformation did its work, everything should be good, and we should get almost no invalid output or transformation at all. I say almost because we do live in the real world, and my expectation is that you would continue to discover little edge cases where, in fact, you needed to push stuff through for whatever reason. It was a form of data that you needed to represent, but you hadn't seen before, so you hadn't accommodated it. Now's the time to accommodate it. So yes, we will in fact be actually working on that XSLT, but the time frame for that is much more relaxed because we've dealt with so many of the problems up front. So of course the next question is, how is that? What form is that schema going to take? I actually think there's a wealth of different approaches there, that any of which might work and all of which might work really well together. We can make things easier for the HTML world if we can provide this kind of early checking on HTML content to check on its suitability for our environment. That means an HTML subset schema that knows what elements and attributes are allowed where. Yes, it's true that we still have the headache about multiple classes, because schema languages, generally speaking, do not support constraints like if the value P is on a class but it's not exclusive, then follow the following set of rules, right? So a schema language like RelaxNG or DTD is not going to do this job by itself, right? But we do have Schematron. I showed you a minute ago how Schematron can help plug the gaps. Interestingly enough, you can use CSS in a really, really simple, false color proof sort of approach to check your HTML, because your CSS can be written to your mapping as well, and so things that haven't been mapped formally can pop out. Eric Vandervliet is an XML developer who a number of years ago developed a technology called Exampletron, and the idea here is that you actually validate documents against sample instances, right? Or, so you're validating your XML against other XML. You've got a canonical JATS document that represents the structures in the JATS that you'll support. You can validate against the JATS that you've already got. Perhaps we could generate an HTML schema from our JATS schema. Or maybe it'll be an HTML schema which has Schematron embedded in it to handle the class problems. Or, in fact, this is something that I've done, we can run a pipeline which will fake it by actually performing the transformation for us right there in the system and then validating the output. Of course, the drawback of that is that the error messages that this pipeline gives us don't really point us back into the HTML because they'll point us to the JATS. But even that is something that's mitigable and possibly something that we can improve. Now, is all this worth the effort? I think the jury is still out on that. I mean, my customer seems to be very happy, and they're rolling forward. You know, it's still very early. So I think, I don't want to make any big promises there, but I'm satisfied that we've got a place to start with this. A couple of acknowledgments. The project here was sponsored by De Gruyter, so thank you to them. I drew on some research done both by Eric and by Norm Walsh on the problem of validating microformats, which is very, very similar to this, online, which you can find. And so there is a little bit of literature on this problem, and I'm hoping that this is a problem that begins to see the light of day better, because the evolution that we're seeing in web technologies is strong enough so that we're beginning to see both more need for this kind of control and more opportunities. I ran out of time. I do have on this system oxygen, so I can run a mini demo, but I'm not sure that's actually maybe I'll open to questions, and you guys can tell me what I should do with the time with that. So, questions. Kevin.
Kevin Hawkins, University of North Texas Libraries. Yes, one of those quiet TEI people, but unfortunately I don't get to do much TEI or JATS these days. So I feel like I must have missed this at the beginning, and if I did, it probably went by fast, but I still think it'd probably be worth explaining a bit more, which is exactly why your customer insists on giving you the data in this in HTML, and is even willing to work with constrained XML. So clearly, this isn't, they're not giving you arbitrary HTML that you really have to deal with. They're already willing to do quite a bit of sort of work here to give it semi-clean. So what is it in the rest of their
Well, actually, I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's really critical to understand the picture here. They were actually starting with JATS. Now, it isn't really rich JATS. They want to enrich it, and they need to edit it. Right? And that was key, right? If they were starting with HTML, it would already be uncontrolled, and imposing rules in their HTML would be very difficult, right? But saying that we're going to start with JATS and then produce a kind of HTML, which is HTML and is tractable for use in your HTML environment, and then give you a way to get it back into your JATS system, that was what they needed. Right? And if they had started at the other end, all of this would be much harder, because we would have had to actually deal with the modeling issues of, and mapping what they had in HTML back into JATS before we could even get to square one, right? So they were starting with JATS, and they were able to go down before they had to go back up again.
Yeah, but why did they have to go down, I think, is what I've
been that was my first question. Right. Why do you have to go down?
Right.
And they said, and that was business constraints on their side. Right? I mean, I would have loved to see them have a web-based front end for their JATS. Then we'd be talking about that, which would be fantastic. But they weren't there with that, and their vendors weren't there with that, so they wanted this HTML thing, and we felt that we could do this with enough, with low overhead, so to actually support that. So that was the whole idea. Evan,
Evan Sinveo. So were they wanting you to support multiple HTML editing environments, or not willing to put the controls there? I mean, we have built a system like this, and the way we did it was primarily by controlling the editing tools, making sure that users could not create wrong things.
Right. Well, and that's
in the HTML.
Yeah, and that's exactly the burden that, when I say, look, I've latent my burden, it's because I passed that burden to them.
Okay.
It's not like the work doesn't have to be done. It's just that I don't have to do it. Yeah.
Sasha Schwartzman, OSA. If I understand the workflow correctly, during the up conversion, the user has to review the infelicity and invalidity errors. And that makes me wonder how scalable this solution is.
Well, that goes to Evan's question. Actually, in this case, the user doesn't have to review it, right? I mean, it does have to be reviewed, but the working hypothesis here is that we're going to make the rule set clear enough to support the development of an environment that has the constraints such that Evan just described, so that in fact, in the editing CMS, it's functioning as an XML-based editing system by another name. Right? Because all of the same kinds of constraints that we would expect to see placed on XML editing are going to be placed on the HTML. It's just that it's going to be in this crypto form where the constraints are not managed in the form of element names and element relationships, but in the relationship among these classes, right? Now, that is a considerable burden to hand the HTML side so that they aren't in the position of having to run the thing and then, right, and hitting that scalability, right? Now, that's not to say that the scalability issue that you just pointed to is not a problem. It is potentially a problem, and in fact, that is potentially a limit to this kind of approach, is that the reason this approach doesn't, it works at all is because it doesn't have to scale to the completely open-ended set of authoring requirements that authors might face. It's scaled deliberately to dealing with the particular editing requirements of this particular system, where they were starting with structured data and they needed to edit it and modify it and wanted to use a web-based system to do that. But it was all going to be within the scope of something that, in fact, is actually really quite familiar to us, right? Move the solution out of that environment, and you would hit the problem that you just talked about, right? That the HTML developers would, they would hit a wall with the complexity if, the content types became too various and so forth and so on, and with respect to that side of the problem, the fact that we were starting in a JATS environment with JATS data, as I just said to Kevin, is like really helping us to hold this thing together, And in fact, it was more than just starting with JATS. It was like we actually had a data set that we could rule everything that wasn't represented in this data set as out of scope for our version, for our pilot version, right? So we didn't even need to go through the JATS GTD. We just pulled the data to decide what to handle, right? So like, for example, the demonstration that feel free to ask me if you want to see it. It doesn't handle arbitrary JATS, right? It just handles JATS that we've seen. Now, it's easy to tweak to handle any JATS that you might give it because the rules are so simple that all we need to add to the transformation is a list of element names for it to recognize, right? And then it would work with whatever, whatever matched that profile. It's not a completely open-ended solution that handles any data of any kind.
Thank you, Wendell.